January 10th, 1943. Inside the Stalingrad encirclement, Wehrmacht soldier Klaus Bernhardt had forgotten who he was. The identity disc attached to his uniform had frozen against his ribs many weeks prior, and he'd abandoned any attempt to read it. He remained seated within the demolished structure of what appeared to have been an educational facility, though the devastation was so complete that identification proved nearly impossible. Surrounding him, figures that once possessed the characteristics of living soldiers now sat completely still in the darkness. Had consciousness left them? Had death claimed them? Bernhardt could no longer distinguish between these states, and increasingly the difference appeared irrelevant. Beyond the shattered walls, an Arctic wind howled across the desolate landscape with a sound resembling metal being torn apart, an endless, torturous scream. Temperatures had descended to a brutal -41 degrees Celsius. Bernhardt examined what remained of his extremities. His left hand was wrapped in a filthy, unchanged bandage that hadn't been replaced in nearly a month. Beneath the soiled cloth, he knew 3 fingers had turned black with gangrene. His right hand gripped a fragment of bread no larger than a postage stamp, his complete daily allocation. He stared at this pathetic morsel, attempting to recall what genuine hunger had felt like in earlier times, back when hunger signified merely an empty stomach rather than this consuming void that devoured him from within. Next to him, Feldwebel Wilhelm Steinbach had ceased all respiratory function sometime during the previous night. Nobody had registered this fact. Nobody possessed sufficient strength remaining to acknowledge it. Overhead, somewhere in the pitch-black sky, artillery rounds screamed through the air. Soviet ordnance, always Soviet ordnance, a mechanical pulse that never ceased its terrible rhythm. Bernhardt closed his eyes and attempted to summon memories of Germany. Verdant countryside, his mother's warm kitchen, the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread. But these recollections were disintegrating, evaporating like morning frost under sunlight. Only the cold remained, only the hunger, only the absolute certainty that death would claim him in this frozen wasteland, and nobody would ever remember his name or his sacrifice. The German Wehrmacht that advanced towards Stalingrad during the summer months of 1942 represented the most formidable military organization on the planet. Over 270,000 soldiers comprised the Sixth Army, battle-hardened veterans who had subjugated Poland within weeks, conquered France within months, and penetrated deep into Soviet territory with the swagger of an invincible war machine. Their commander was General Friedrich von Manstein, a precise and methodical staff officer who had contributed to planning Germany's most spectacular victories. The force was equipped with Panzer III and IV battle tanks, thousands of artillery weapons, mechanized infantry divisions mounted in armored half-tracks, and complete support from the Luftwaffe's most seasoned bomber squadrons. Their objective was crystal clear: seize Stalingrad, the sprawling industrial metropolis stretching along the mighty Volga River, then push southward to capture the oil-rich fields of the Caucasus region. Without petroleum resources, Stalin's entire war apparatus would collapse catastrophically. Soviet tanks would become nothing more than rusting monuments. Aircraft would deteriorate on airstrips. The entire Red Army would grind to a complete halt. Adolf Hitler believed Stalingrad represented the decisive key to ultimate victory on the Eastern Front. More significantly, he desired its capture because it carried Stalin's name. Seizing it would constitute both a strategic victory and a symbolic humiliation of his ideological adversary. The propaganda value alone was incalculable. The German Wehrmacht that marched towards Stalingrad during the summer months of 1942 composed confident correspondence to loved ones back home. They sang traditional marching songs with enthusiasm. They discussed being home for Christmas celebrations, of triumphant victory parades and medals and career promotions. One lance corporal named Dieter Schmidt from Dresden penned a letter to his betrothed. "The Russians are completely finished as a fighting force. We shall take Stalingrad within 2 weeks, perhaps 3 at most. Keep your wedding dress ready and pristine. I shall return home by October." He would never see his homeland again.
He would perish in February, frozen completely solid in a basement cellar. His body would be so severely emaciated that Soviet soldiers who discovered his corpse believed him to be a teenage boy rather than a grown man. None of them, not the common soldiers, not their commanding officers, not even the prestigious generals stationed in Berlin, comprehended that they were marching deliberately toward the largest mass grave in all of military history. They were about to enter an absolute nightmare from which only 6,000 of them would eventually emerge alive. The remaining hundreds of thousands would find only death in that frozen hell. The military offensive commenced with devastating fire from the sky. On August 23, 1942, over 600 Luftwaffe aircraft launched an assault on Stalingrad in the most concentrated aerial bombardment of the entire Eastern Front campaign. Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers descended with their characteristic sirens wailing their terrifying song. Heinkel He-111 medium bombers flew in precise formation, their bomb bays opening to release tons of high-explosive and incendiary ordnance. Dornier Do-17s followed in successive waves, dropping their deadly payloads on a city constructed primarily of wooden structures. The result was nothing short of apocalyptic destruction. Within mere hours, Stalingrad was consumed by massive firestorms that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Complete neighborhoods vanished within walls of flame. The Volga River itself appeared to be burning as ruptured petroleum storage tanks spilled their flammable contents into the water. Civilians who sought protection in underground cellars suffocated as the firestorms consumed all available oxygen from the air. Others were incinerated instantly where they stood, their bodies reduced to ash. In a single afternoon, approximately 40,000 innocent civilians perished in unimaginable agony. When darkness finally fell, the flames were visible from 70 kilometers away, a hellish glow that transformed night into an artificial day. Survivors who emerged from shelters discovered their world had been transformed into a nightmarish landscape of ash, rubble, and death. Buildings had collapsed into skeletal frameworks of twisted steel and shattered concrete. Corpses lay scattered in the streets, burned beyond any possibility of recognition. The air was thick with acrid smoke and the nauseating smell of burning human flesh. But despite the absolute devastation, despite the unimaginable horror, the city refused to surrender. Stalin had issued his infamous Order No. 227 on July 28, 1942. The decree carried a simple but terrifying message: not one step back. The order was absolute and uncompromising. Retreat without explicit authorization meant immediate execution. Officers who withdrew their forces would face firing squads. Soldiers who attempted to flee would be shot by NKVD blocking detachments positioned strategically behind Soviet defensive lines. There was no option for retreat. There existed only two possibilities: victory or death. General Vasily Zaitsev assumed command of the Soviet 62nd Army defending Stalingrad on September 12, 1942, at a moment when German forces had already penetrated to the city's center. Zaitsev was a compact, powerfully built veteran with a face resembling carved granite and a volcanic temper that terrified his subordinate officers. He had survived the brutal Soviet Civil War, Stalin's paranoid purges, and savage campaigns in Finland. He comprehended immediately that conventional defensive tactics would prove futile. The Germans excelled spectacularly at combined arms warfare, utilizing tanks, artillery, and air power in coordinated assaults that shattered defensive lines with mechanical efficiency. In open terrain, the Wehrmacht was essentially unbeatable. But Stalingrad offered no open terrain whatsoever. The Luftwaffe bombing campaign had transformed it into an intricate maze of rubble, collapsed buildings, and twisted infrastructure. Zaitsev reckoned
Every building would become a fortress, every pile of rubble would become a defensive position, every basement would become a bunker.
The city would be defended block by block, house by house, room by room, and if necessary, floor by floor. The combat that followed was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced throughout the entire war. In Poland, major battles lasted mere days. In France, perhaps weeks at most. In Stalingrad, battles raged for months over single buildings. The fighting was savage, intensely personal, and utterly merciless. The grain elevator near the Volga became legendary throughout both armies. This massive concrete structure was defended by a small Soviet garrison, fewer than 50 men, against repeated German assaults supported by tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers. For 5 consecutive days, from September 17th to 22nd, the defenders maintained their position. German infantry attacked in wave after wave, hurling grenades through shattered windows, firing machine guns through doorways, using flamethrowers to burn out defenders room by room. When German forces finally broke through on the 6th day, they discovered the garrison had been completely annihilated. Bodies were piled in stairwells. The floors were ankle-deep in spent shell casings. Blood covered every surface. The Germans had sacrificed over 100 men to capture a single building. Sergeant's House became another powerful symbol of seemingly impossible resistance. On September 27th, Sergeant Ivan Nikolaev led a small platoon across an exposed square under heavy fire and captured a 4-story apartment building. What followed was a 58-day siege that captured the imagination of the Soviet propaganda machine. Nikolaev's men, Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and Georgians, representing the multinational Soviet state, fortified the building with mines, barbed wire, and machine gun nests positioned at every window. They knocked holes through internal walls to move between rooms without exposing themselves to sniper fire. They dug a communication trench to the Volga for supplies and reinforcements. German forces attacked daily with fanatical determination. Infantry assaults, tank-supported attacks, artillery bombardments that lasted hours and reduced surrounding buildings to rubble. They never took that house. Soviet propaganda later claimed that more Germans died attacking that single building than died taking all of Paris. While certainly exaggerated, the claim contained a kernel of truth. In Stalingrad's close-quarters combat, defenders with determination and strategic positioning could hold against numerically superior forces. One German infantryman, a schoolteacher named Hans Müller from Bavaria, wrote in his diary in mid-October, "We have been fighting continuously for 15 days for control of a single house. The front line is a corridor between burned-out rooms. It is the ceiling separating 2 floors. We attack with grenades, machine guns, and bayonets. From story to story, we bombard each other through smoke and dust. We can hear the enemy breathing mere meters away. We can smell them. We fight for control of a single room for 3 days, then realize they are still in the cellar directly below us. This is not war as we were trained for. This is mutual annihilation." By late October, the Germans had captured most of Stalingrad's ruins and pushed Zaitsev's 62nd Army into a narrow strip of rubble along the Volga, sometimes no more than a few hundred meters wide, but they couldn't deliver the final decisive blow. Every attack gained meters at enormous cost. German casualties mounted into tens of thousands. Elite divisions were ground down to mere shadows of their former strength. Then came November 19, 1942, a date that would seal the fate of the entire Sixth Army. The Soviet counteroffensive, codenamed Operation Uranus, began at 7:20 a.m. in fog and snow, so thick visibility was measured in mere meters. Over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously along an 80-kilometer front north of Stalingrad. The barrage lasted 80 minutes, a rolling thunder that shattered Romanian defensive positions, destroyed command posts, and obliterated communication trenches. The Romanian Third Army holding the northern flank was poorly equipped and undermotivated. Their anti-tank guns dated from World War I and couldn't penetrate modern Soviet armor. On November 23rd, at Kalach, 40 kilometers west of Stalingrad, the pincers closed. Soviet forces from north and south met and linked up.
The trap snapped shut with mechanical precision. The entire German Sixth Army, over 290,000 men, was encircled inside the pocket. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Luftwaffe commander and Hitler's close confidant, personally assured the Führer that his air force could deliver the necessary supplies. He cited previous airlift operations as proof. The Luftwaffe could do this, he guaranteed with absolute confidence. It was perhaps the most catastrophic lie told during the entire war. The Luftwaffe did not possess 500 tons of daily airlift capacity. Distances were too great, over 200 kilometers from the nearest German airfields. Weather was too unpredictable, with blizzards and fog that grounded aircraft for days at a time. Soviet fighters patrolled relentlessly. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the pocket. Airfields inside were under constant artillery bombardment. On the best days, the airlift delivered 100 tons. Average days brought 50 tons. Many days, nothing arrived at all. Inside the pocket, rations were cut immediately and drastically. Within days of encirclement, soldiers received 300 grams of bread, smaller than a human fist, then 200 grams. By December, 100 grams, the size of a playing card. Meat disappeared. Vegetables became distant memories. Horses were slaughtered systematically. Over 30,000 animals were butchered for food. But the cold was infinitely worse than the hunger. December brought temperatures that veterans said they'd never experienced in their lives. -30 degrees became normal, -35, -40 degrees on the worst days. At these temperatures, the world becomes fundamentally hostile to human life. Exposed skin freezes within minutes. Breath freezes in lungs. Metal becomes so cold that touching it tears flesh away. Weapons malfunction. Vehicle engines refuse to start under any circumstances. Frostbite became epidemic throughout the pocket. Soldiers wrapped feet in newspaper, in rags torn from corpses, in anything that might provide insulation. Nothing helped sufficiently. Toes turned white, then gray, then black as tissue died. Fingers became useless. Ears and noses blackened and fell off like dead leaves. By early January 1943, the pocket had shrunk dramatically. Soviet forces attacked relentlessly, using massive artillery barrages followed by infantry and tank assaults. German defenders, weakened catastrophically by starvation and cold, could barely hold positions. The airfield at Potomnik, the main supply drop zone, fell to Soviet forces on January 16th. Thousands of wounded soldiers waiting desperately for evacuation were captured. The last airfield, Gumrak, fell on January 22nd. Even the trickle of supplies stopped completely. The Sixth Army was sealed in its tomb, dying by degrees. Hitler promoted von Manstein to Field Marshal on January 30th, a promotion carrying dark implications. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered in the entire history of the German military. The promotion was an order disguised as honor. Von Manstein was expected to fight to the death or commit suicide. On January 31, 1943, Friedrich von Manstein sat in the basement of the Univerum department store, the final headquarters of the Sixth Army. Above, Soviet tanks cleared the last blocks of resistance. Around him, staff officers waited in silence, faces gaunt, uniforms hanging loosely on starved frames. Outside, -42 degrees, the wind howling like a tortured beast. Von Manstein had received Hitler's message promoting him to Field Marshal. But the strategic impact was seismic and irreversible. Germany lost an entire army, one of its finest forces. The Sixth Army ceased to exist as a fighting force. 22 divisions, hundreds of thousands of men who had marched confidently across Europe were gone forever. More importantly, Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. The blitzkrieg that had terrified all of Europe was stopped, surrounded, and methodically destroyed. Not primarily by superior tactics or heroism, but by the cold mathematics of encirclement, starvation, and winter.
Today, the ruins have been rebuilt is Volgograd. Mamayev Kurgan, the bitterly contested hill, is crowned with "The Motherland Calls," an 85-meter statue visible for miles in every direction. Beneath that massive statue, in soil churned by millions of shells, construction workers still occasionally find relics: bullets, helmets, dog tags, bones. German and Soviet, they lie together in the earth, united in death. The soldiers who died in Stalingrad, German and Soviet alike, didn't die for grand strategy or ideology in the end. They died because they were there, trapped in a battle neither side could abandon without admitting defeat. Germans died because Hitler refused any retreat for political reasons. They died because Goering promised supplies that never materialized. They died because nobody adequately planned for winter conditions. They died of hunger in a pocket that received flights but never enough supplies. They died of cold because wool uniforms and summer boots couldn't protect against -40-degree temperatures. The Lance Corporal Dieter Schmidt from Dresden, who wrote confidently about being home by October, froze to death in a basement in February. The schoolteacher Hans Müller from Bavaria, who described fighting for a single room, died of starvation on January 28th, his diary found beside his emaciated body. Stalingrad stands as a monument not to war's glory, but to its absolute horror. It demonstrates with brutal clarity what happens when human beings are ground down between the unyielding machines of total war and the crushing indifference of winter. It shows that courage, training, and superior equipment mean nothing against starvation and extreme cold. It proves that even the mightiest army can be destroyed not by enemy strength alone, but by its leadership's stubborn refusal to accept reality. The nightmare lasted 290 days, and when it finally ended, Hitler's once mighty army was frozen, starved, and utterly defeated in the snow. A cautionary tale for all time about the cost of hubris and the absolute horror of modern warfare.